Let's face it, one does not simply skip the intro to Streets of Rage. Welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to a more current quality standard. Today I'm taking another look at Streets of Rage, also known as Bare Knuckle, for originally Sega Genesis or Mega Drive depending on where you are, and it was later re-released on numerous other systems. What you're seeing here is the re-release on PC, specifically the Sega Genesis Classics Collection version. This is a side-scrolling beat-em-up developed and published by Sega that was originally released for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive for our friends across the pond in 1991, and it later saw a re-release on a lot of different systems, including the Game Gear back in the day, as well as numerous other systems in various collections over the years. And while it was certainly very well received back in its day, in the years following it, it's become one of those must-own titles if you happen to have a Genesis or a Mega Drive. Which of course brings up the question of whether or not it still holds up to this day, or whether or not it was any good to begin with. Well, let's go ahead and start delving into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, and why it's considered an absolute classic by most. And like always, we're going to start by going over the presentation, which is actually one of the big draws of the game. Well, for one, the sprite work is pretty fantastic across the board, although the characters don't really hold up quite as well as the environments do. Because while the characters do have a pretty decent amount of detail packed into them, they have rather low numbers of frames in their animations, so everything looks kind of jerky. But that was actually fairly normal until you hit the later periods of Sega Genesis or Mega Drive game development, so it's not really something that you can hold against the game too much. But no, what really steals the show in terms of the visuals is the environments. The backgrounds have a huge amount of detail packed into them, and various effects that really do make things pop. And to this day, the environments still look pretty fantastic, so they did an absolutely brilliant job with that. But then there's the sound design, and that's what completely steals the show in terms of presentation. And it's not because of the sound effects, although they did certainly do a pretty good job with those for that particular time period. And it's not for the minimal amount of voice clips, which basically consists of people screaming when they're attacking things. Instead, it's because Streets of Rage has one of the best soundtracks in video game history. What Yuzo Koshiro was able to squeeze out of the sound chip for the Sega Genesis is nothing short of amazing. And what you end up with is a soundtrack that includes elements of electronic dance music as well as hip-hop and R&B that not only is instantly recognizable as, yep, that's Streets of Rage, but it's also just brilliant music in and of itself. It's the kind of stuff you can listen to even outside of the game and go, yeah, that's good dance music. But don't take my word for it, just have a listen. Of course, that's just a few short samples of the soundtrack, but you get the idea. The music in this game is absolutely fantastic, and frankly, if you don't find something to like about it, then I'd say there's probably something wrong with you. It is an absolutely perfect soundtrack for going around and beating up a bunch of bad guys who've taken over your city, and on top of that, it's just great music in general. There's not a single bad track on here, even though there are a few that I'm not particularly fond of. But of course, the only reason I'm really not all that fond of those particular tracks is because the rest of the soundtrack is just so damn good. And I'll probably be called a blasphemer for this, but I'd say that Streets of Rage 1 actually has the best soundtrack in the entire series, even though Streets of Rage 2 does come very close. But here's the thing. It really doesn't come down to the soundtrack or even the visuals. What it really comes down to are story, or rather lack thereof considering the genre this is in, and the gameplay. So let's go ahead and get the story out of the way. It's really no more complicated than that intro you saw. In fact, that tells you pretty much everything you need to know. The idea is that a criminal syndicate has taken over your city, and you play as one of three characters, Axel, Blaze, or Adam, and you're basically trying to take down that syndicate on your own. Between that intro and the ending, there's really nothing in terms of storyline. You're just running around beating up a bunch of bad guys, so when you do finally get to the ending and you're actually given a choice, it's a bit surprising. Of course, regardless of which ending you choose, it doesn't really matter all that much in the long run because there's almost no story to this game anyway, so it's not like there's a lot of build-up to that choice. So ultimately, everything does fall to the gameplay, and that's where this game does shine and also kind of falters a bit. Streets of Rage keeps things pretty simple. You have a basic attack button, you have a jump button, and you have a special attack button. Now the special attack button is pretty simple. All it does is call in off-screen support, which will wipe out all of the enemies on that particular screen, and if you're fighting a boss, then it's going to take a huge chunk out of their health. But you only have one use of that per life per stage, and what I mean by that is, if you use it up in the stage and you survive the whole stage, then you get a new one at the end of that stage. But if you use it and then you end up losing a life later on, then it actually gets replenished while you're still in the stage. The only other way you can replenish them or get an additional one is to actually find a pickup somewhere in the level that will give you an additional super attack. The idea with the super attack, of course, being that you hold it in reserve until you absolutely need it. So what you're going to be relying on most of the time are the basic attack button and the jump button, which, depending on what combination of things you use, will do different attacks. For example, if you just jump, then you'll jump. If you jump and then press the button to attack, then you'll do a jump attack. If you press both of them simultaneously, then you'll actually attack behind you. Beyond that, you have a basic 4-hit combo, which is slightly different depending on which character you're playing. For example, Blaze has a somersault as her final hit in that attack, and there's actually a pretty significant delay between her third hit and when she does that somersault. That, combined with her slightly lower damage output than Adam and Axel, makes her actually the most difficult character to play, because she ends up having to rely more on throwing enemies as well as doing jump attacks. This brings up something else that's important to mention, that when you get close enough to an enemy, you'll actually automatically grab onto them, and then you can either just do basic attacks in order to do a 3-hit combo, which does a lot of damage, or you can throw them behind you across the screen, or you can actually jump over them and then just slam them head first into the ground. All of which, of course, does quite a lot of damage. The thing is, you have to be very careful with that because sometimes things don't always go in your favor. For example, there's certain boss enemies that are very fat, so when you grab onto them and try to slam them over your head, or you try to throw them, they just fall on you and do damage to you instead. Then of course there's the 2 palette-swapped Blazes that you fight at the end of Stage 5 and later on in the game, where they basically just throw you around like a ragdoll whenever you get anywhere near them. And to be perfectly honest, I've never figured out a good strategy for them. I always just end up wasting all of my super attacks on them, and then when I get to the very end of the game, when it has the sort of boss rush stage, then I just kind of muddle through it as best I can, because when you get to that stage, then you actually can't use your super attack anymore. But anyway, the point is that even though you're limited to 3 buttons, you actually have a fair few options for how you're going to fight the enemies throughout the course of the game, and you're also going to have various items that you can pick up that will help you as well. For example, you can pick up baseball bats or pipes to smack enemies around with. You can pick up knives that you can either stab or throw with. You can pick up beer bottles that you can smash over an enemy's head, and then you can actually start stabbing with them. And there's even a can of pepper spray that you can throw at an enemy, which is kind of a funny way of doing it, but then it'll stun them for a few seconds. Not to mention that if you're playing this in 2-player mode, then you actually can do tandem moves where one player will basically throw the other player at the enemies and they'll be able to do quite a lot of damage with it. Unfortunately, though, I can't show you how that's done because, unfortunately, I can't actually play this in multiplayer at the moment. You have to have someone with you playing it at the same time because it's a Genesis game and it doesn't have online play or anything. And while I do actually have this game on an actual Genesis, the recording I'm showing you here is of the PC version, so it'd be kind of a mess to set up 2 players on it. And even if I tried to record it on an actual Genesis, I would still need someone physically there to play as player 2 as opposed to, say, doing it over network or internet play. So sorry about that, but even though I have played 2-player before and I know how it works and everything, I just can't show you that in this particular video. Now that said, a word of warning if you do decide to play this in 2-player and you do actually have the opportunity to get someone physically there to play it with you, you have to be careful where you're throwing your punches and everything because you can accidentally hit your teammate and it will do damage to them, so you gotta be very careful with that in order to avoid them hating you for it. But that said, you would be playing through the exact same game that you're playing through as a single player, it's just with more enemies on screen, including dual bosses as opposed to just one boss at a time. So that ultimately brings us to the question of how this is overall as a beat-em-up game. Well, it's a very solid beat-em-up game mechanically, although it would pretty quickly become eclipsed by the likes of Streets of Rage 2, which, let's face it, mechanically is a much better game than this. But that doesn't mean Streets of Rage 1 isn't worth playing, it just means that it's simpler. Oh, I think we can probably all agree that whenever you fight the palette-swapped Blaze sprites, they are ridiculously cheap, so that's definitely a pretty nasty mark against it. But beyond that, it's a very solid beat-em-up game with an absolutely fantastic soundtrack. It's just that the sequel did exactly what it was supposed to do, which was take what the original game did well and improve upon it. So you may have a bit of difficulty going back to Streets of Rage 1 if you've played Streets of Rage 2 or 3 and gotten used to the way those feel in terms of mechanics. But if you can put that aside and actually get used to how this one feels, it's not that much of a jump that you're going to be completely lost. I would still say that if you have a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, then you should own a copy of the original Streets of Rage. Despite a few issues with some cheap bosses here and there, as well as the general simplicity of the mechanics compared to its sequel, it still holds up really well and is still quite a lot of fun to play. If you're new to beat-em-up games, you'll find that this one is pretty easy to pick up and play, and if you're a fan of beat-em-up games, or you already have played the second and the third game but you haven't played the first game, then I'd say go ahead and pick up a copy. It's worth playing. For those of you who are interested in picking it up, I will have a link in the video description box to where you can find it. Thanks for watching.